This is the Nikon D850. It has an insane 45 megapixel sensor along with an almost perfect body and design. But this camera has been out for a while and it doesn't have the fanciest features when compared to a modern camera. So I wanted to see if the Nikon D850 was still good enough by today's standards by using it on a real shoot and comparing it to a more modern camera. Also, I'll leave links down below for the best pricing on the Nikon D850. So let me start off by saying that the body and design on the D850 is a photographer's dream. It has a button or dial for pretty much everything you want. It has a dial on the left side that controls how fast your camera shoots in photo mode, and it also has a specific button just for bringing up your white balance mode, quality mode for photo if you want to shoot RAW or just JPEG, and even your metering modes. And there's specifically a specific button just for changing your camera modes from manual to shutter priority to aperture priority. And it even has a button right at the front that lets you switch between autofocus mode and manual focus mode. And on the back, you actually have a D-pad for changing all of your menu settings, but also controlling your autofocus points, but also a joystick to quickly change your autofocus points. And one thing that's kind of cute is that the buttons even light up when you turn this camera on. So if you're in a dark studio environment, you can simply look down and see exactly the buttons that you need to look at without struggling in the dark. As for the viewfinder, it's actually an optical viewfinder, which means you're actually using this viewfinder to look directly through the lens, and it's not an electronic viewfinder like the one you find on most modern mirrorless cameras. The viewfinder itself is really big and comfortable to use. Like when I put this up to my eye, it doesn't feel like I'm looking through a tiny hole like it is on most cameras. It really feels like a really wide viewfinder. But one downside of the optical viewfinder is that because it's not an electronic viewfinder with an LCD screen inside of it, when you look through it, you can't really judge your exposure or how your photos look, and you have to actually take a photo and see how your exposure is. And the D850 also has a really solid grip in your hands. It is a pretty chonky camera, but that's to be expected because it is a DSLR, but it's a really satisfying camera to hold. The screen on the back is a tilt screen, so it comes out and you can use it for high angle and low angle shots, but it's not a side articulating screen, which you see on most modern cameras. This I don't think is a huge issue because this is really meant for photographers or video shooters that are behind the camera, but it's something to know. But one thing that really surprised me is that the screen on the back is also touch sensitive, which means you can use it for touch autofocus and navigating your menus, but you can't use it to change any of the major settings on your cameras. So you can't use it to change your shutter, aperture, ISO, or go over different like quick menu settings. But one thing that I should mention is that the screen on the back does go black when taking photos. So in order to see what you're shooting, you have to use the optical viewfinder, but I wouldn't have it any other way because listen to the shutter sound. So satisfying. A single battery on the D850 will easily last your entire photo or video shoot and maybe even a little bit more. However, I actually recommend getting the D850 with the vertical grip. This way you get a bunch of additional benefits to your camera. One, you get 2 additional batteries at the bottom, so your camera is going to be able to shoot for days, but you also get an additional vertical grip so you can shoot your camera vertically way easier because it has a shutter button at the top, a shutter dial, and an aperture dial, along with a joystick in the back for changing autofocus points, and also a custom button right next to your shutter button. But on top of that, this grip can also help your camera shoot faster. Yes, it actually lets your camera shoot more photos, which I'll explain exactly how that works in just a second. And the D850 also has dual card slots, but only one of these slots is an SD card slot. The other one is actually an XQD card slot, but CF Express Type B card should also work. Personally, in my testing, I simply used a single V90 SD card, which did perfectly fine. And if you wanted, you could have an SD card slot in one, XQD or CF Express type card in the other one, and you could still dual write your cards, have photos go to one, video go to one, or just make backups on both cards. As much as I love the battery grip, something that I should mention is that it does make your camera significantly heavier. This camera now is easily 2 to 3 pounds, and while that may not matter to you if you're in a studio, this is a pretty chunky camera, and even doing this review, I'm having a hard time holding it. But what I'm most excited about this camera is the 45 megapixel full frame sensor, so it's time to take this camera to the real world. For my first shoot, I ended up working with a model, and the 45 megapixel sensor gives you an insane amount of detail. Even with a wide shot, I could easily zoom in and see the tiniest little bit of detail in all of my photos. And I also got some casual walk around shots in my city with the D850, and it's insane how much room you have to crop with a 45 megapixel sensor. If you're someone that's really serious about shooting landscapes and you want to make sure you get the perfect framing in all of your shots, using a high resolution sensor like the 45 megapixel sensor in the D850 is going to give you the perfect framing for all of your shots. When it comes to shooting speeds, the Nikon D850 only shoots at 7 frames per second, which isn't that fast when compared to modern cameras. But if you add the battery grip, it actually boosts that power and gives you 9 frames per second, which is really close to most modern cameras which shoot 10 or maybe 12 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode. However, mirrorless cameras can also do electronic shutter mode, which can give you frame rates as high as 20, 30, or even 40 frames per second, which is a lot faster than the D850. And the autofocus worked flawlessly. I did not have a single out of focus photo. Trust me, I looked. I could not find a single photo out of focus. For most of my shooting, I used both the viewfinder and the screen on the back with touch autofocus, and both did a really good job with the autofocus. When it comes to editing raw photos from your D850, the dynamic range is stunning. You can bring underexposed shadows back to a normal level or overblown highlights back to a normal level without sacrificing image quality, and I'm actually really surprised that there's still detail in the highlights and shadows considering how overexposed or underexposed they were. And I was still able to do my usual editing with cropping and color grading with zero issues, but having a 45 megapixel sensor actually made my job a lot easier, because for some of my photos I shot them for really far away with a 24 to 105 lens, and with this sensor I was able to zoom in without losing any detail, and honestly you can't really tell I cropped this photo. So photo is pretty amazing on the Nikon D850, but when it comes to video, it's a whole different story with a few surprises. When the D850 first came out, it was actually a really impressive video camera, because for the time, most DSLR cameras were not that great with video, and with the Nikon D850, you actually get 4K without crop at 24 and 30 frames per second, which for most cameras at the time would actually give you a pretty significant crop, and the 4K usually didn't look that good either. So to really put the Nikon D850 through its paces, we actually shot a music video and a fashion commercial with this camera. And I'm really surprised by how good it looks, considering it's not downsampled 4K or it's not really doing anything fancy. But the 4K definitely looks great. However, it does not shoot 4K at 60 frames per second, which is a pretty common feature nowadays on most cameras, so it's a little disappointing to see, but again, older camera. And if you do want slow motion, it still does 1080p at 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion, and 1080p up to 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion, and the slow motion for 120 frames per second is already slowed down for you in camera. And the autofocus in video mode is pretty good. It does a decent job considering the fact that it also has touch autofocus using the rear screen, but it's not amazing by any means, especially when you consider that most modern mirrorless cameras now have eye tracking, face tracking, goal tracking. I'm funny. But modern mirrorless cameras are just simply better when it comes to autofocus tracking, and this camera is good enough for simple shots where you just want to get focus, move your camera a little bit, but it's not really going to be great at tracking a subject. However, the video autofocus will be totally good enough for casual shooters. One thing the Nikon D850 is definitely missing is cinematic color profiles or a log profile for color grading, and the color in this camera is also only 8-bit color. However, I still think the colors and the images out of this camera look really, really good. And I'm really happy with the results of the music video and the fashion commercial. And in my opinion, unless I was doing something very, very serious with video, this is totally fine for taking photos in a studio and then just switching over to video mode and getting a little bit of video as well. This is still a decent video camera, but it's maybe not quite as good as a modern video camera. So is the Nikon D850 actually worth it, and does it hold up by today's camera standards? Well, the answer is very, very complicated. As a photo camera for 45 megapixels at this price is insane. This camera is such a good deal for photo shooters. But when it comes to photo speed, this camera is a little bit slow at only 7 frames per second, so I feel like you have to get this camera with a battery grip to really make it worth your while, which does add to the cost. And the autofocus in photo mode, perfection. I cannot believe I did not have a single out of focus shot while shooting. Really impressed. But what about as a video camera? Is the D850 still worth it? Well, it depends. If you're a photographer who wants to have a little bit of video in their camera, you kind of want a hybrid camera combo, this is really, really good. 4K video at 24 and 30 is probably going to be enough for you. You can flip down to 1080p for 60 and 120 frames per second. But if you're someone that's more of a casual user, you're still going to get a great experience from this camera. The only person that's probably going to struggle with using the D850 as their main camera is probably a professional video shooter. You guys are going to want good tracking autofocus, which the D850 does not have. Good video autofocus, but it does not do subject tracking. And on top of that, it's only 8-bit color, not 10-bit color. That's definitely going to be an issue for you. So if you're a professional video shooter, you're going to have to upgrade. I recommend the Canon R6 Mark II. It's my most recommended camera of the year. It has a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, full HD up to 180 frames per second, and 4K 60 with amazing tracking autofocus. The D850 is a phenomenal photo camera, and this will actually be my main photo camera for the rest of the year. This was actually on loan to me from one of my good friends, Lane Dorsey. You see him in the Peter McKinnon videos, and I'm just not gonna give this camera back. Come fight me, bro. But this is a phenomenal camera, and I recommend picking one up. And if you wanna make sure you get the best possible pricing on your D850, make sure to check out the links in the description down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.